Welcome to a live recording of Disability Wrap in honor of National Cerebral Palsy Awareness Month. I'm Courtney Williams, Disability Wrap's production assistant, and I have a few housekeeping and accessibility tips before we get started. As you were alerted when you joined, this webinar is being recorded. Our panel discussion will air March 13th on KVMR Nevada City and on the Disability Wrap podcast. We have ASL interpreters on today's webinar. We have them spotlighted for all webinar participants, so one of them should be visible at all times. Zoom automatic captions are also available. To turn those on, click on the Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen. For our panelists who have a speech disability, their assistants will repeat their comments. Depending on how the discussion goes, Ana may open it up at the end for some questions from the audience. If she does, you can submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If that's not accessible for you, you can also raise your hand at the end, and Ana might call on you to ask your question verbally. We have turned off the group chat on today's webinar. However, if you have any access issues or questions, please put those in the chat and we'll work to address those as best we are able. And now, a bit about Disability Wrap. Disability Wrap first aired in 1987 on our community radio station, KVMR in Nevada City. Back then, it was a live radio show produced by Freed to lift up the stories and voices of people with disabilities. We've been on air ever since, covering current and emerging issues in the disability community. Today, the show is hosted and produced by Carl Sigmund and Lindsay Wells, two Freed staff members who have cerebral palsy. You can find us on KVMR, or you can subscribe to our podcast at disabilitywrap.org. And now I'll turn it over to our guest host, Ana Acton. As many of you know, Ana is the Deputy Director for the Independent Living and Community Access Division at the California Department of Rehabilitation. But before that, she was our Executive Director here at Freed and the longtime host of Disability Wrap. Ana, it's great to have you hosting this episode, and we thank you and the California Department of Rehabilitation for making this event possible. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Courtney. It is so wonderful to be back here at Disability Wrap. It's been a few years, and it's so great to see the work that you're all doing to continue this legacy that really started with Tony Sauer, who was an executive director at Freed back in the 80s. And then I was able to host it for some years, and now to see Carl and Lindsay really doing an amazing job with hosting it. So thank you so much for having me join. So today I'm joining you from the California Department of Rehabilitation, where we work with consumers throughout the state on their employment goals. We work with community partners to ensure that people with disabilities have access to community living and employment to be able to work, live, and play in their setting of choice. So it's quite the honor to be back here in celebration of Cerebral Palsy Month. So a little bit about the National Cerebral Palsy or CP Awareness Month. It's a month-long event when people with cerebral palsy and friends and allies come together to share stories and advocate for full integration for people with CP in all parts of society. It was started by an advocacy group in 2006, and the initiative gained steam in 2013 when the US Congress passed a resolution designating March 25th, 2013 as National Cerebral Palsy Awareness Day. So today we're going to celebrate with an amazing group of panelists here with us today. So I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. I'm going to start with Alexa Guerrero. Alexa is a systems change advocate at Placer Independent Resource Services, or PEERS, as we like to call them, in Auburn, California. During her time in college, Alex was a youth disabled and proud volunteer for the California Foundation for Independent Living Centers. This experience opened her eyes to the importance of advocacy, and by the end of her time at as a YO volunteer, she knew that she wanted to pursue a career in disability advocacy. I also would like to welcome as a panelist today, Dr. Toni Saye, which I'm probably saying your name incorrectly. She's She's an assistant professor and the director of the Rehabilitation Technology Certificate at San Diego State University within the Department of Administration, Rehabilitation, and Post-Secondary Education. Her professional work history has involved advocating for a progressive understanding of disability within the applied field and a shift from the diagnosis to disability as a culture and identity. And I love your shirt, Tony. It says, disability is not a bad word. We'll have to ask a little bit more about that today. I also want to welcome to the panel, Carl Sigman is the operating manager at Freed and co-host and co-producer of Disability Rap radio show and podcast. In addition to his role at Freed, Carl is a research engineer in the Speech Disorder and Technology Lab at the University of Texas at Austin, where he works to improve speech recognition algorithms for people with speech disabilities. Welcome, and thank you for inviting me, Carl. I also would like to finally introduce our final panelist, Lindsay Wells. She's the disability community advocate at Freed and co-host and co-producer of Disability Rap radio show and podcast. In her role at Freed, as Freed's disability community advocate, Lindsay advocates with and for people with disabilities and older adults to exercise their civil rights on local, state, and national level. Welcome to our panelists. So I am really excited to be here with all of you today to talk a little bit about cerebral palsy, talk about disability, one of my favorite topics. And while I am not a person with CP, I am a wheelchair user and have a disability myself. And so feel like I'm well surrounded with great allies here today on our panel. So I just want to start by getting to know each of you a little bit better and get to know who you are, what you do, and a little bit of your disability story. So with that, I'm actually going to start with the co-host of the show, Carl Sigman. Can you get us started with telling us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you, Ana, for coming back on the show. It is a pleasure to be in the room by you.
Well, thank you, Ana, for coming back on the show. It is a pleasure to be interviewed by you.
Oh, so I grew up obviously with CP. I use a wheelchair and walker. I obviously have this speech disability.
So I grew up obviously with CP. I use a wheelchair and walker. I obviously have this speech disability.
My parents made a very conscious decision that I should be educated in the mainstream, not in special ed classes. So that's what happened.
My parents made a very conscious decision that I should be educated in the mainstream, not in special ed classes. So that is what happened.
And then how I ended up out in Nevada City is I actually ended. I actually attended a high school semester program right outside of Nevada City the year before college, and that was really the first time I was out on my own 3,000 miles away. I'm gonna put my producer's hat on for 1 second. Next second, you turn on your video if you're able.
And then how I ended up in Nevada City is I actually attended a Quaker high school semester program right outside of Nevada City the year before college. And that was really the first time I was out on my own, 3,000 miles away. And I'm going to put my producer's hat on for 1 second. Alexa, can you turn on your video if you're able?
So before you go on more, Carl, let me just stop for a second because you took me right back. I was working in Nevada City area during that time, and there was this rumor about this guy, Carl, who had moved into the area. And I'm pretty sure the first story I heard about you was that you had repelled off the South Yuba River Bridge to the water. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Oh, Anna, you are sharing all of my secrets.
Oh, Anna, you're sharing all of my secrets.
So real quick for the record, that was not when I was a high school student. That was later. But yes, it is true. And I actually did a twice. And it's actually a much easier way for me to get down there. Getting up is another story.
So real quick for the record, that was not when I was in high school. That was not when I was a high school student. That was later. But yes, it is true. I actually did it twice, and it's actually a much easier way for me to get down there. Getting back up is another story.
Well, before we move on then, so I'd like to actually go to one of the next panelists to kind of get a little bit on, again, your disability story, your story of who you are, where you came from. So I'm going to go on over to Tony. Tony, this is the first time that I've had an opportunity to meet you and to interview you, and I've heard amazing things. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
So hi everyone, I'm Dr. Tony Saya. I am a very proud disabled woman. I think it's important to lead with that because I think oftentimes people see disability as a tragedy, as something to be fixed and cured. And for me, a disability is a part of my culture. It's a part of my identity. And I am very proud to be in the community and then also doing disability work because I truly believe that disabled people should be leading these initiatives, these conversations. I mean, we understand our experience best. I always jokingly say that I didn't fly out of the womb with a disability culture book, but I did fly out with a lot of low expectations that were placed on me by medical professionals. And so very early on, my mom retells a story where a doctor shared she's a shell, pretty on the outside, nothing going on inside. And this is before I had an opportunity to do or be. And I am very grateful that my parents did not buy into these low expectations. I am also I jokingly say that I am very lucky that I am one of four and the baby. My parents did not have any time to helicopter me and they were tired. And that was the greatest thing that could happen to me, because that meant that they just raised me like their other children, and that allowed me to navigate the world, right? I don't want to say that in a way that they ignored my disability experience. They absolutely didn't. But really what they were doing, and at that time I didn't have the language for that, but really what they were doing was the social model of disability. They were manipulating environments so I could fully participate. I am passing over Zoom, but I am a proud wheelchair user. I definitely see my wheelchair as a chariot of freedom. It allows me to navigate a very inaccessible world. Um, and again, early on, didn't have the language, but we didn't do things that I couldn't participate in. Right. And so they were definitely manipulating environments and making conscious decisions to ensure that I could not only, I think so many times around the disability experience, we focus on inclusion and just getting to the table. But I think more importantly, it's not just about getting to the table, but do you feel welcome, seen, and heard at the table? That's what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in a long table that just allows us to be. I'm interested in sometimes breaking down the table. And also, again, that value, are we valued as disabled people? Because again, I think so many times in the service world, I think there's this misconception that disabled people only exist to be serviced. And I just want to share that we are much more than the services we may or may not receive. We have talents, we have goals, we have skills, and we also may use services, but we don't exist in this world to be serviced. And so, yeah, I'm really, really pumped to be here. I'm excited to be among other disabled people. And I just really appreciate, again, the opportunity.
Thank you so much. I feel like we're done. No, I'm kidding. No, but you touched on some really important topics I think we want to go deeper into today, right? Like about disability identity and pride, and how many people with disabilities are either born into this world or acquire their disability and face a society and world, right, where there's low expectations, like you said, and people just don't see our intrinsic value, our skills, the amazingness that we basically bring to this world. So we're going to talk more about that. But first, I'd like to go over to Lindsay and have Lindsay tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Wells. I'm the disability community advocate here at Freed, and I have spastic cerebral palsy. I'm a twin, and I was born in the early 80s. And when I was born, there were some complications, and I asked my dad about this because I wasn't aware at first of what was going on, but he said that my brother's heart monitor stopped. And so they had to go in and get us. And when they did, they had to get us out in a hurry. And they had pulled me out first, and I looked good, and they set me aside. And they didn't realize at the time that I had spastic cerebral palsy. And as I aged into schoolhood and went through that, I was in special education for the first 4 years of my school. And then my mom realized that I should be totally mainstreamed. So in that regards, I was kind of like Carl when my parents realized that at an IEP meeting that I should not be in special education. But unfortunately, the teachers didn't see it that way. And a teacher told me that I would never graduate high school, well, I proved her wrong, and I even went to college. So you never know. You can't just assume that somebody can't do something because of a disability. It doesn't work like that. And I come from a big family, and I'm one of the babies, and I was never treated like I had a disability. I was always treated that I had to learn to do things more independently than I would have if I hadn't had the disability. I always knew I had a disability, but when I reached school age, I was finally figured out that yes, indeed, I have a disability because my family had never really, told me. It was the school kids that told me. So, but yeah, so today I'm just happy to be here, a part of this panel, and I'm looking forward to the next few questions.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you. So some interesting kind of themes too, right? It seems like for Carl, yourself, and Tony, that your parents, your family actually chose to basically see you as a whole person, right? And have similar expectations, would it be safe to say, as they had for their other children? So Alexa, welcome again. And tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am Alexa. I grew up in Santa Rosa.
I was always mentioned
And I was always in general ed.
but when I was born, the doctor told me that just forget about me. I will not do this.
And when I was born, the doctors had told my parents to forget about me and that I wouldn't be able to do anything.
But I do too because I wish not only did I got with my both which doctors and this
But not only did I prove them wrong, I graduated, and then I graduated college as well.
the inside
With my BA in child development
but
from Sac State. And I use an electric wheelchair to get around.
Because I went to camp.
And the reason I like to tell people that I ended up in SAC is because I attended Camp Womp. Camp Womp.
It was so much. We were living under that just for a week. Not inside out. We were under that just and we were not inside at all.
Because we were under the stars and we weren't inside at all.
If I only wanted to go back, but I knew not to become a disability, but I felt this. Yes.
I knew I always wanted to go backpacking, but I knew that I couldn't because of my disability until I found that camp.
So as soon as you,
So never underestimate yourself.
thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I definitely share your love for the outdoors. So I was someone who acquired a disability. Unlike you all who were born with a disability, I acquired a disability as a freshman in high school. It took me a while to kind of get on board and then realize that I could do anything that anyone else could do. It just might look different. There might need to be different accommodations and considerations, right? So, I wanted to kind of follow up with a couple of the things that came out of your introductions. And one of them is something, Tony, that you mentioned, and that is finding your disability identity. And there was discussion about disability pride. I'm curious, and Tony, I'd be happy to start with you. What's that process like, about really finding disability identity and having pride in who you are when maybe the rest of the world is telling you that you're less than? So Tony, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think for me, disability culture and disability pride I was able to engage in that once I was really connected to the disability community, right? Being in community and being immersed in spaces where we're embracing disability as a cultural identity, I had the opportunity to learn about my history. I mean, just as an example, like how many people take an average history class where we learn anything about disability history? The answer to that is probably very few. And this is interesting given that disability is the largest growing minoritized group. It is the only minoritized identity that cuts across every other culture and experience. And so this erasure of our history is very telling about how we feel about the disability community systemically, right, and societally. And so when I was in community where I had opportunities to embrace that, when I've engaged in advocacy spaces where they're being led by other disabled people, I had an opportunity to see my disability in another framework. I think that really changed the game for me. And disability pride and culture does not mean that you don't have any challenges. I mean, we are navigating in a world that's not made for us. So of course, there are challenges and barriers and hurdles. Yes. However, I think I'm able now to make the distinction that the problem is not me and my body and the way I navigate the world. The problem is society. And that distinction allows me to explore my identity, my culture as a disabled person. And so I think that shift in burden of where the burden lies, right? That doesn't mean that I'm not frustrated when I can't access a space, absolutely. But I'm no longer angry at my body and how my body shows up. I'm angry that I do not have access. And so I think I was able to make that shift, really being immersed in disability spaces where people are showing up unapologetically themselves. And that really gave me an opportunity to really question society as a whole. But like any other form of pride and identity and culture, right? It's not one directional. It's not like you achieve it and it's like, check box, I have pride, right? It shifts depending on the spaces I'm in. So for example, if I'm the only physically disabled person in a space, the safety I feel around my identity and culture may be different than if I'm among other of my people. I call them my people, right? My community, right? And that is not really a me problem. That's a society problem that we're not creating safe enough spaces for people to bring their whole self to the table. And that's true in the workforce as well, right? And I often hear, well, oh, they're not out as disabled or there's stigma. And it's like, well, can they be out? And if they become out, what do we do to embrace their experience?
Well, and I think it's really important to just recognize that, the disability pride piece doesn't mean that everything's easy. It doesn't mean that there's no issues. It doesn't mean that we don't have hard times, okay, at times, right? It's not trying to pretend like all that isn't there because, I know a lot of people who come to their disability in different stages in their life, right? And often there can be trauma involved, there can be grief
Right.
involved, right? There are all those pieces. Those are all real.
Right.
But you know, to the point of finding disability community, you know, Carl, you know, talk to us about like, what was that path of finding community? And, you know, disability community, because that didn't come immediately for you, I don't think.
No, it didn't come really until I found free or free another way free from me.
No, it didn't come really until I found Freed, or put another way, until Freed found me.
And then freed, which I think everyone here knows, but maybe not everyone on the podcast. So we are the independent living center serving 5 counties in Northern California, and we are a peer-led disability resource and service agency, and that peer-led piece is key because we are people with disabilities providing services, and dare I say mentorship to other people with disabilities and older adults in our community.
And then Freed, which I think everyone here knows, but maybe not everyone on the podcast. So we are the independent living center serving 5 counties in Northern California. And we are a peer-led disability resource and service agency. And that peer-led piece is key because we are people with disabilities providing services and, dare I say, mentorship to other people with disabilities and older adults in the community.
So Carl's sort of going back to that piece about finding community by connecting with others with disabilities, right? And, you know, I think one of the things that kind of struck me as Tony and you were both talking was how, you know, we're really kind of flipping around, we're trying to change and flip society's view on disability, right? So there's been this historical, you know, history on this medical model that we talk about on disability, and then really looking more as a social model on disability, really turning upside down, right, our internal and society's view on disability, which I would argue is maybe one of the biggest barriers that still exists for people with disabilities, is just society's view, right? And lack of expectation and belief in us. But, you know, for Lindsay or Alexa, you know, both working within the independent living movement, working within that social model on disability, what would you add? What can we do to really start the community and society really understanding the value of disability?
I would say, this is Lindsay. I would say that we have to be out in our communities, talking to people, getting them educated on what we need to say to them about not only cerebral palsy, but all kinds of different disabilities. Like the medical model might have been a hindrance for us. A social model could be wonderful, but there are doctors and there are people out there that still think of the medical model first. So if we're out in the community saying, hey, no, wait, check this out, to see who we are as individuals first, and then we can move forward. But we have to be those advocates, not only for ourselves, but for everyone that has a disability. And as my job at Freed, I'm working to advocate for people with disabilities, but I'm not working by myself. It's a joint effort with the person with the disability and myself. So I think if we get the community together and just be out there and say, this is us and we're not going away, so figure it out. I think that I think there is a social stigma and it has to go away, and it's only going to go away if we come together and if we come together and communicate that to the public.
Thank you so much. And, you know, we've been talking, right, about the social versus medical model and disability. This is where the conversation took us, right? And Alexa, I'm curious to hear from you. Where do you still see, sorry, my Alexa just responded. Where do you see in your life, even today, that medical model show up versus a social model? And I'm just curious, do you have any examples of experiences where you still see that old historic view on disability?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Every day, people until I get up, be by myself or think by myself.
People always assume that I can't think for myself or I can't get around by myself.
Look, I job and be married.
That I can't have a job or be married.
And that it's fun.
And they just assume that I'm from a group home,
It's very not good at all.
which is not very accurate at all.
I'm an older boy with 2 kids.
I have my own apartment with my own 2 crazy dogs and my husband.
And why I want to get off AI this really it's it.
And this is why I have been working on disability etiquette training.
I live so far. Believe
And so far, I have presented to the Office of Elections and the Auburn Police Department.
And this is very new to hell. One day, I hope it will be very good.
And this is still in the works, but I'm hoping that one day this will be mandatory for first responders. And everybody in the workforce.
Because it's study for every child and new object with the ability.
Mainly because it's already 2024, and I don't think society should have this certain view on people with disabilities.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for sharing. I think that it's interesting, right? How often there's misunderstanding around disability, where if you have a speech disability, if you use a wheelchair, people might assume other things about you. I want to shift just a little bit here and talk a little bit about employment, and kind of your road to employment, and what that experience was like for you, including, did, it's not coincidental, again, that I think that like all of you are in a disability specific field. Was that by choice, or is this the only option that you felt like you had? For me, when I first got into the workforce, I was trying jobs that weren't disability specific, and I had a really hard time getting hired. People thought it was liability. They weren't sure how I was going to be able to do the job. But I don't think that's the case for all of you. So talk to me, like, what was that experience getting into the workforce, and what barriers did you encounter when doing that? And I guess we'll start with let's see, I'll switch it up just a little bit. Lindsay, do you want to get us started on that?
Yes, I will. So I have my degree in early childhood education, and I went to go look for jobs working with preschoolers, and they said, oh, they would interview me and want to see me. And as soon as they saw me in person, this is way before the pandemic. As soon as they saw me in person, they would change gears. Oh, you're overqualified. Oh, we don't need this. Oh, the position's been filled. So for me, it was a lot of your experience as well. I came to Freed kind of saddened about not being able to work with children like I had intended. But when I became a part of Freed, I realized this is exactly where I needed to be. And I'm more thrilled now to be a part of Freed and to have the association of Carl and all of my colleagues, and Alexa, my peers advocate colleague. It wasn't the path that I chose to begin with, but I ended up in the right place.
I can relate. So what about you, Tony? Talk about how you got to what you're doing now, and what do you do?
Yeah, so I want to say, I mean, it's yes and, because these questions are nuanced, right? I often joke around that I eat, sleep, dream disability, right? Because I don't get to turn it off at 5, but also because I do disability work. I mean, as a assistant professor in, at SDSU, I'm teaching within the rehabilitation counseling program. And yes, that is, very disability related. I would say, so two things, like, when I was kind of going through school, I originally wanted to be a speech therapist, but I realized earlier on that role wouldn't give me enough of the advocacy role that I wanted. And so I kind of switched to rehab counseling. But I want to say that even when you do disability work, it's not there, the employment barriers that you might face in the job, in the job process. So as an academic jobs are really, I mean, there's a lot of ableism in them, right? And so all because you do disability work doesn't mean that there are no ableism in the process. And so when I entered the job market, it I had this feeling of, I never knew if I wasn't getting the job because I wasn't qualified or because of that I was disabled. And that's a feeling that I think disabled people feel all the time. right? It's like, did we not get this opportunity because we're not the best fit or because of the attitudinal barriers? And I remember earlier on, I didn't immediately know, I kept my options open. Do I want to be in academia? Do I want to be in, and I remember one job I applied for. I had to enter the back alley entrance and pass all the garbage, right? And I knew then, even though I was really qualified for the job, they weren't going to give me the job because they weren't going to feel comfortable watching me every day go through the garbage. And they weren't going to come up with another solution enough to hire me. And so I think that's a real thing to acknowledge, that there are barriers that gatekeep disabled people from other fields. That does not mean, for all my people listening, I love my job. And I think that the disabled people should be in my job. And I think it's really important for my students to have a physically disabled faculty member. I think representation matters. I think I'm great at my job, not in spite of my disability, but because of my disability, because I add a lens that no textbook can teach you. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that people experience attitudinal and environmental barriers related to the job in the job market. And a lot of times it's the attitudinal barriers. It's not just that there's no ramp, there's no ASL interpreters. It's those things, but it's also the attitudes. And so I do worry that oftentimes unintentionally, we funnel disabled people into jobs where we already have connections rather than what are best fits for them because of these attitudinal barriers, right? And I think that sometimes happens in DOR, where it's like, we might have a connection with this group, so we might, encourage our clients to go that way. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what they want to be. So I would say that I think that attitudinal barriers are a real thing, but I am proud that I am in the disability space. I think this is where I belong. But not every disabled person should have to do disability work to have a
Right.
job. And that's
Yeah.
like the point I'm trying to get at. Not myself, but I think it's ridiculous. Like, if you want to be a hairdresser, you should be able to be one. Just, as an example. So, yeah.
So, Carl, what do you have to add to the conversation?
Yeah, I want to add a couple things here.
Yeah, I want to add a couple of things here.
I think it was my time at Freed that really showed me how I could ask for reasonable accommodations and what those accommodations would enable me to do.
I think with my time at Freed, that really showed me how I could ask for reasonable accommodations and what those accommodations would enable me to do.
I'll give you one example. Before I got to Freed, I was in another state, and I was beginning to notice how much opportunity was opening up for me when I had someone repeating what I said in a professional context.
I'll give you one example. Before I got to Freed, I was in another state and I was beginning to notice how much opportunity was opening up for me when I had someone repeating what I said in a professional context.
If I went to someone who was actually rather high up in that state's rehab department, and I asked her, can or can I have a employer pay for this service as a reasonable accommodation? And that person said no.
And I went to someone who was actually rather high up in that state's rehab department. And I asked her, can I have an employer pay for this service as a reasonable accommodation? And that person said no.
And then I got to plead and on that you were still here, and the moment you saw how it worked, you sent me the book.
And then I got to Freed. And Anna, you were still here. And the moment you saw how it worked, you said, send me the bill.
So that really opened so many doors. I would argue it enabled me to step into the management position I have now. So just one example of business.
So that really, really opened up so many doors. I would argue it enabled me to step into the management position I have now. So just one example of many.
Well, okay, so there's so much we could talk about. There are so many different topics, reasonable accommodations, employment, but we only have a few minutes left. I'd like to do a lightning round with each of you and really ask you to respond to what can the listeners, those listening right now, do to address ableism, to ensure that people with disabilities are fully integrated into all aspects of society, whether we're talking, just all aspects. So lightning round, each of you, and Alexa, I'm going to have you go first here. What are the things those that are listening right now can do to help address the issues we've been talking about today?
I wish I don't have to already ask. We know ourselves best.
I would say always ask, never assume, because we know ourselves best.
Wonderful. Lindsay, what can those listening do?
Get out in the community, start talking to people about what ableism is and why it's not appropriate at this time.
Carl.
See people for who we are and ask questions.
See people for who we are and ask questions.
And Tony, what can we do as a society? Those who are listening, what can they do today to help address ableism?
Support and uplift the experiences of disabled people and whatever your roles are. Look to elevate those experiences. And also, it is your job to educate yourself on ableism. Yes, disabled people can be leading those conversations, but it is not our burden to carry alone. All of you have a duty to read, to engage in conversations and learn and educate yourself. But remember, make sure you're getting the education from disabled people.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today on Disability Wrap. Carl, I want to thank you and Lindsay for asking me to host today's session. I am honored to have been chosen. And just thank you all for the wonderful work that you're doing to ensure that people with disabilities are able to live, work, and play in their setting of choice and be able to live the dream, right? Live the dream, whatever that is for that individual. And so with that, thank you so much for joining us today on Disability Wrap.
Thank you. I'm not thank you from all of us. Good night.
Thank you, Ana, and thank you to all of our guests. Good night.